Welcome back, everyone. Imagine losing the person you love most in a tragic accident. But you can't shed a single tear because no one knows he existed. That is the suffocating reality for Victoria. She thought she was playing a dangerous game with a secret lover to escape her cold marriage. But when he dies in a mysterious crash, she realizes she wasn't the player. She might have been the pawn all along. This story is called My Cheating Wife Froze in Shock. It's a dark, twisted ride through high society, betrayal, and a husband who knows far more than he says. If stories about complex love, dark secrets, and shocking twists speak to you, please hit subscribe and stay with me. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. Let's begin.
The phone call didn't shatter the silence of the Beacon Hill Library. It sliced through it like a scalpel. It was 11:42 p.m., raining in Boston. A cold, relentless sheet of gray that battered the bay windows. Victoria held the receiver, her knuckles turning the color of old ivory as the police officer's voice droned on the other end, professional and detached. They weren't calling to tell her that her husband was hurt. They were calling because her number was the last one dialed on the shattered cell phone found in the wreckage of a car that wasn't hers, belonging to a man she wasn't supposed to know. Across the room, Julian sat in his leather armchair, turning the page of his book. He didn't look up. He didn't ask who was calling. And in that terrifying stillness, Victoria realized the accident wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was that Julian didn't look surprised. If stories about the dark, quiet corners of marriage intrigue you, stay with me. The rain in Boston had a way of sounding like polite applause, a rhythmic, gentle patter against the glass that masked the violence of the storm outside. Inside the library of the St. James Estate, the air was dry, scented with old paper and the distinct metallic tang of expensive scotch. Victoria Sterling sat on the edge of the velvet chaise, her posture rigid. The landline receiver felt heavy in her hand, a black anchor dragging her down into the depths of a nightmare she hadn't woken up from yet. "Mrs. St. James?" the voice on the other end repeated. It was Detective Miller. Rough, tired, calling from a precinct that smelled of stale coffee and bad choices. "Are you still there?" "I'm here," Victoria whispered. Her voice sounded foreign to her ears, too calm, too steady. Inside, her chest was a hollow cavity where a heart used to beat. "As I said, we found your number on the victim's phone. It was the last outgoing call, made at 11:15 p.m. The crash occurred at 11:17 p.m. 2 minutes. Chase had called her 2 minutes before his vintage Mustang wrapped itself around the guardrail on Storrow Drive. She hadn't answered. She had been in the shower, washing off the scent of him from their afternoon at the Archer, preparing to play the role of the devoted wife for Julian. I see," Victoria said. "I don't know why he would call me. He was just an acquaintance, an art consultant." "Of course, ma'am. We just need to verify the timeline. It was a nasty mishap. The roads are slick tonight." "Is he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The word dead felt like a weapon she wasn't licensed to carry. "He was pronounced dead at the scene. I'm sorry." The receiver clicked back into its cradle with a finality that echoed in the high ceilings of the room. Victoria didn't move. She stared at the Persian rug, tracing the intricate red patterns with her eyes, trying to keep the bile from rising in her throat. Chase is gone. The man who had held her 3 hours ago, whose paint-stained fingers had traced the line of her spine, was now just a body in a morgue. "Bad news?" The voice came from the armchair by the fireplace. Julian turned a page of his book, the sound crisp and sharp. He didn't look up. He was wearing his reading glasses. the ones that made him look scholarly rather than predatory. Victoria froze. She had almost forgotten he was there. That was the nature of their marriage. Two ghosts haunting the same castle, rarely acknowledging the other's rattling chains. A wrong number, Victoria lied. She stood up, her legs trembling beneath the silk of her evening gown. She needed a drink. No, she needed to scream until her throat bled. At this hour? Julian asked. His tone was light, conversational. He finally looked up, closing the book on his lap. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and terrifyingly unreadable. You look pale, Victoria, as if you've seen a ghost. She walked to the wet bar, the crystal decanter clinking against the glass as her hand shook. She poured a double shot of bourbon, bypassing the ice. Just a headache. The weather. The weather is indeed treacherous tonight, Julian mused. He stood up, smoothing the creases of his trousers. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and precise. He stopped just behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, yet he didn't touch her. Driving would be dangerous. I'm glad you're home safe. Victoria took a sip of the bourbon. It burned, but not as much as the implication in his words. Home safe. Did you know, Julian continued, his voice dropping an octave, intimate and soft, that the police scanner is quite active tonight? I heard sirens earlier, near the river. Victoria turned around slowly. Julian was watching her. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hands, which were gripping the glass so hard her knuckles were white. He knew. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He didn't know the details, surely, but he knew something had broken tonight. Julian, she started, but the name caught in her throat. Go to bed, Victoria, he said, stepping back, dismissing her as easily as he dismissed a junior associate. You have a long day tomorrow. The charity auction needs your attention. We can't have you looking distraught. He turned off the lamp, plunging the library into semi-darkness. Only the embers of the dying fire cast a glow on his face. He smiled, a tight, controlled expression that didn't reach his eyes. After all, he added, accidents happen. We simply have to clean up the mess and move on. Victoria stood alone in the dark as his footsteps faded down the hallway. She realized with a chilling certainty that the crash on Storrow Drive was just the beginning. The real wreck was standing right here, in this room, holding a glass of bourbon and a secret that might kill her. The morning sun over Boston didn't bring warmth. It only brought visibility. Victoria sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked impeccable. Her hair was swept up in a chignon that defied gravity. Her skin was porcelain smooth, thanks to a layer of foundation that cost more than most people's rent, and her eyes were dry. She had wept silently in the shower until her chest ached, but now the mask was back in place. Red suits you, Julian said from the doorway. Victoria didn't flinch. She capped her lipstick, the metallic click sounding like the cocking of a small pistol. It's for the Heart Foundation auction. Red is the theme. Appropriate, Julian replied, adjusting his cufflinks. Hearts are such fragile things. The charity auction was held at the Mandarin Oriental. It was a sea of black ties and designer gowns, a shark tank where the currency was gossip and old money. Victoria moved through the crowd with the grace of a practiced dancer, Julian's hand resting possessively on the small of her back. His touch was light, but to Victoria, it felt like a brand. Every time he squeezed her waist to guide her toward a donor, she felt the phantom weight of Chase's hands. Rough, artistic, desperate, and the nausea rolled in waves. "Victoria, darling," exclaimed Mrs. Vanderwall, a woman whose diamonds were only outshined by her malice. "You look stunning. But have you heard? That terrible accident on Storrow Drive last night. A young man in a Mustang. Dreadful." Victoria's smile didn't waver, a testament to years of training. "I heard. A tragedy." "They say he was an artist," Mrs. Vanderwall continued, leaning in. "A bit of a bohemian type. I wonder what he was doing driving so fast in that weather." "Perhaps he was running from something," Julian interjected smoothly, handing Victoria a glass of champagne. His eyes locked onto hers, dark and unyielding. "Or running to someone." The glass in Victoria's hand felt slippery. She took a sip to stop herself from screaming. The room was closing in. The laughter, the clinking crystal, the smell of expensive perfume. It was all suffocating. She needed to see where he died. She needed to see the violence of it to believe it was real. 2 hours later, she feigned a migraine. It was the only excuse Julian accepted without question, perhaps because he preferred her silent and absent to emotional and present. He sent her home in the town car, but as soon as the driver pulled up to the Beacon Hill estate, she waited for him to leave, then took her own car, a nondescript SUV she used for errands, and drove. Storrow Drive was wet and slick. The city lights smeared across the windshield like oil paint. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the curve near the Longfellow Bridge. She slowed down, ignoring the honks of the impatient drivers behind her. There it was. The guardrail was twisted, a mangle of steel that had been hastily cordoned off with yellow tape that whipped violently in the wind. The asphalt was stained dark. Oil, fuel, maybe blood. There were shards of glass swept to the side, glittering like cruel diamonds under the streetlights. Victoria pulled over into the breakdown lane, hazard lights flashing. She shouldn't be here. It was reckless. If a patrol car stopped, if a reporter saw her. But she couldn't stop herself. She stepped out into the cold wind. The smell hit her instantly, burnt rubber and damp earth. It was the scent of the end. She walked toward the railing, her heels clicking on the pavement. She looked down at the twisted metal. This was where Chase Rivers, the only man who had made her feel visible in 10 years, had taken his last breath. But as she stared at the skid marks, a frown creased her forehead. The marks were long and straight, leading directly into the rail. There was no swerve, no erratic pattern suggesting a slide on wet pavement. It looked deliberate, or it looked like he hadn't braked at all. And then she saw it. Tucked into the mud at the base of the support beam, half buried by the rain and debris, it was a small silver lighter. A Zippo. Victoria's breath hitched. She scrambled down the slight embankment, ruining her heels, and snatched it up. She wiped the mud off with her thumb. Engraved on the side were the initials CR. She had given this to him 3 months ago. He never went anywhere without it. But why was it here outside the car? If he had been inside the wreckage, the personal effects would have been collected by the coroner. Unless he had thrown it out, or dropped it, or unless someone else had been here. A pair of headlights swept over her, blinding and bright. A police cruiser slowed down in the adjacent lane. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She shoved the lighter into her coat pocket and turned away, shielding her face, scrambling back toward her car. She got in and locked the doors, her hands shaking so hard she could barely grip the wheel, As she merged back into traffic, her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a text from Julian. "Hope the headache is better. I'm home. We need to talk." Victoria stared at the screen. The lighter burned a hole in her pocket, a cold piece of evidence that the accident was anything but simple. She put the car in drive, terror rising in her throat. She was going home to the lion's den, and she had just stolen a bone.
Hold on. Let me pause here for a moment. The contrast here is absolutely heartbreaking. 1 minute she's surrounded by champagne and fake smiles at a gala, and the next she's digging through mud to find a cheap Zippo lighter. That lighter isn't just an object, it's her only proof that her feelings were real. It's devastating to see her mourn in silence while the world keeps partying. If you were in her position, could you keep that mask on? Or would you break down right there?
The talk Julian had summoned her for turned out to be a masterclass in sadistic pragmatism. He hadn't asked where she had been or why her shoes were flecked with mud. Instead, he had met her in the foyer with a glass of water and a message. Detective Miller needed her to come down to the precinct. A formality, Julian had called it. A way to close the loop, so the investigation wouldn't linger on the St. James name. He had even arranged the appointment for first thing in the morning, stripping Victoria of any excuse to delay. Now, sitting in the sterile, gray interrogation room of the District D4 station, Victoria wished for the silence of her library. The room smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. Detective Miller sat across from her, a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and exhaustion. "Mrs. St. James, thank you for coming," Miller said, sliding a manila folder across the metal table. "I know this is difficult, but since your number was the last one dialed, we need to clarify the victim's state of mind." Victoria kept her hands folded in her lap, squeezing her fingers until they went numb. "I told you, Detective. I didn't answer the call. I don't know what he wanted." "We know you didn't answer," Miller said, his eyes sharp. "But he was on the phone with someone else right before he called you, and he was agitated." Miller tapped a laptop sitting open on the table. The Mustang was equipped with a dash cam. It recorded both the road and the cabin audio. The video cuts out at the impact, but the audio, well, it tells a story. Victoria's breath hitched. She hadn't known about the camera. Chase drove, a classic car. He hated modern technology. He must have installed it recently. "Why are you showing this to me?" "Because," Miller said, turning the screen toward her, "he mentions a name. We thought you might recognize who he's talking to." Miller pressed play. The screen showed the rain-slicked stretch of Storrow Drive, the wipers slashing back and forth in a hypnotic rhythm. The engine roared, a deep, throaty growl that Victoria knew intimately. Then, Chase's voice filled the small room. It was loud, distorted by the poor microphone, but undeniably him. "You can't do this!" Chase yelled at the empty car. He was on speakerphone. "We had a deal. I stayed away." Victoria's heart slammed against her ribs. A deal. A voice on the other end of the line crackled back. It was muffled, low, buried under the noise of the rain and the engine. It was impossible to make out the words, just a deep, rhythmic murmuring. "I don't care about the money anymore!" Chase screamed, swerving slightly as he passed a sedan. "I'm going to tell her. She deserves to know that her whole life is a lie." Victoria froze. Tell her. Was he talking about her? The muffled voice on the speaker spoke again. This time a single word cut through the static, sharp and commanding. It sounded like, "Wait." Then, the sound of the engine changed. It revved high, a terrifying mechanical scream. Chase shouted something incoherent, panic, pure and raw. "The brakes! I can't—" The video spun violently. The horizon tilted. The sound of metal tearing into metal was deafening, followed by a sudden, absolute silence. Miller stopped the video. Victoria sat paralyzed. The room felt like it was spinning. The brakes. He had said the brakes. "He was arguing about money," Miller said, watching her face closely. "And a woman. She deserves to know. Any idea who that woman might be, Mrs. St. James? Or who he had a deal with?" Victoria swallowed hard. Her throat felt like it was filled with glass, shards. The muffled voice on the recording, it was distorted, yes. But the cadence, the calm authority in the face of Chase's panic, it sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "No," Victoria lied, her voice trembling. He had many girlfriends. He was an artist, dramatic." "Right," Miller said. He didn't sound convinced. He closed the laptop. "The tech boys are trying to clean up the audio to isolate the other voice. If we get a clear print, we'll find who he was talking to." Victoria stood up, her legs feeling like water. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of this room before she confessed everything. "Is that all, Detective?" "For now," Miller said. As she reached the door, he added, "Oh, one more thing. The mechanic looked at the wreck this morning. The brake lines were cut, clean. It wasn't an accident, Mrs. St. James. It was a homicide." Victoria didn't turn around. She walked out of the station into the blinding daylight of the Boston streets. The noise of the city rushed at her, but all she could hear was the echo of that muffled voice on the tape. She knew that cadence. She had heard it every night across the dinner table for 10 years. Julian. The house was quiet, but it was a silence that felt heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. Julian was upstairs. Victoria could hear the faint, rhythmic thrum of the shower running in the master bath. 20 minutes. That was his routine. He would shower for exactly 20 minutes, steam the day's filth off his skin, and emerge smelling of sandalwood and moral superiority. Victoria stood in the hallway, staring at the mahogany door of his study. It was the one room in the house she rarely entered, not because it was locked, but because Julian had cultivated an aura of sanctity around it. It was where the real work happened. She pushed the door open. The hinges were well oiled, they didn't make a sound. The room was dark, illuminated only by the streetlights filtering through the heavy drapes. It smelled of old leather and the expensive cigars Julian smoked when he won a case. Victoria moved quickly, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but Detective Miller's words echoed in her mind. The brake lines were cut. She started with the desk. It was an antique piece, massive and imposing. The surface was clear, save for a laptop and a Mont Blanc pen. She opened the top drawer. Neatly stacked files, legal pads, a box of mints. Nothing. She moved to the side drawers. Bank statements, property deeds, the mundane architecture of their wealthy life. She was about to give up, to convince herself she was being paranoid, when a soft, vibrating buzz cut through the silence. It was short, rhythmic. Bzzzt. Bzzzt. It wasn't coming from the desk. It was coming from the bookshelf behind her, hidden behind a row of leather-bound law encyclopedias. Victoria froze, glancing at the ceiling. The water was still running upstairs. She moved toward the shelf, her hands trembling as she pulled back a volume on maritime law. Behind it, nestled in the dark gap between the wood and the wall, was a phone. It wasn't Julian's sleek smartphone. It was a cheap plastic burner phone, the kind sold at gas stations for cash. She picked it up. The screen was lit up with a notification, low battery. Victoria pressed the unlock button. There was no passcode. Her thumb hovered over the call history icon. She felt a wave of nausea. If she looked, there was no going back. If she looked, she wasn't just a grieving mistress. She was a witness against her husband. She tapped the screen. The log was short. Only one number was listed, repeated over and over for the last 3 months. She didn't recognize the number, but she recognized the timing. Outgoing call, yesterday, 11:15 p.m. Incoming call, yesterday, 11:17 p.m. The timeline aligned perfectly with the dashcam footage. The argument, the crash. She scrolled down to the messages. There was only one draft, unsent, typed 3 days ago. Offer stands at $500K. Leave Boston. Leave her. Or the deal is void. Victoria gasped, covering her mouth with her hand to stifle the sound. Leave her. Julian hadn't just known. He had been negotiating. He had been buying Chase off. And Chase, her beautiful, reckless Chase, had apparently accepted the deal or refused it, leading to the argument in the car. The shower upstairs stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Victoria's blood ran cold. She hastily wiped her fingerprints off the cheap plastic screen with the sleeve of her robe and shoved the phone back behind the books. She pushed the encyclopedia back into place, ensuring the spine was perfectly aligned with the others. She backed out of the room, her breathing shallow and ragged. She made it to the hallway just as the bathroom door creaked open upstairs. Victoria? Julian's voice drifted down the stairs, calm and resonant. She leaned against the wall, trying to slow her heart rate. I'm just getting some water, Julian. Bring me a glass, would you? He called out. I'm parched. Victoria walked to the kitchen, her legs feeling like lead. She filled a glass with water, watching her own reflection in the window. She looked the same as she had 10 minutes ago, but the woman staring back was different. She was no longer just a wife. She was living in a house with a monster who had priced her infidelity at $500,000 and executed a death sentence when the negotiation failed. She gripped the glass. She had to go upstairs. She had to hand it to him. She had to smile. The South End loft was exactly as she remembered it. A brick and beam converted warehouse that smelled of linseed oil, turpentine, and the cheap clove cigarettes Chase smoked when he was frustrated with a canvas. Victoria stood before the heavy steel door, the key trembling in her gloved hand. She had given him this key chain, a simple leather strap, and kept a copy hidden in the lining of her jewelry box. She turned the lock. It clicked with a heavy industrial thud. She pushed the door open and stepped into the shadows. She expected the chaos of a grieving space, unfinished coffee cups, overturned stools, the debris of a life interrupted. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the grime-streaked windows, she stopped cold. The studio was pristine. It wasn't just tidy, it was sterile. The floor, usually splattered with dried acrylics and charcoal dust, had been swept. The easel standing in the center of the room, which had held his latest work, a portrait of her, abstract and raw, captured in shades of blue and gray, was empty. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. Victoria rushed to the vintage steamer trunk at the foot of the bed. This was where he kept them. The letters. The foolish, reckless, handwritten letters she had sent him over the last 6 months. Letters that detailed not just their love, but her hatred for the life Julian had built around her. She threw the lid open, empty. The trunk smelled of cedar and emptiness. No sketchbook, no letters, no Polaroid photos of them tangled in the sheets on Sunday mornings. She spun around, scanning the room frantically. The shelves were stripped of specific items. His art supplies were there. His clothes were hanging in the closet. But anything that proved Victoria Sterling had ever set foot in this room was gone. The silk scarf she left last week? Gone. The bottle of wine they were halfway through? Gone. The mug with her lipstick stain? Gone. It wasn't a robbery. Thieves took cameras, laptops, cash. Chase's laptop sat untouched on the desk. This was an erasure. Victoria sank onto the mattress, the springs creaking beneath her weight. The bed was made with military precision, the sheets pulled tight. Chase never made the bed. She realized then the terrifying scope of Julian's efficiency. He hadn't just arranged for Chase to die. He had arranged for him to disappear. By removing the evidence of the affair, Julian had effectively trapped her. If she went to the police now to claim her husband murdered her lover, she would have no proof that a lover even existed. She would look like a hysterical, grieving woman inventing a narrative to escape a marriage. Her eyes fell on the floor near the radiator. Something small glinted in the dust, missed by the cleaners. She crawled over to it. It was a single cufflink, gold, engraved with a small crest, the St. James family crest. Victoria picked it up, the metal cold against her skin. Julian had been here. He hadn't just hired someone, he had come himself. She could imagine him standing in this room, assessing the threat level of her happiness, methodically placing her love letters into a trash bag, his face impassive as he dismantled the only thing that made her feel alive. She clenched the cufflink in her fist until it hurt. He wanted to wipe Chase from the earth, to pretend this chapter of her life never happened. He wanted to reset the board to 0, but he had made a mistake. He had left a piece of himself behind in the wreckage. Victoria stood up. The tears that had been threatening to fall finally evaporated, replaced by a dry, burning rage. She wasn't going to run anymore. She wasn't going to hide. If Julian wanted a war of silence, she would bring the noise to his front door. She pocketed the cufflink, walked out of the studio, and locked the door. She didn't look back. There was nothing left in that room but ghosts, and she had a demon waiting for her at home.
Think about this for a second. Julian didn't just kill a man, he tried to erase him from history. Emptying the art studio is such a massive power move. It's his way of saying, I own your past, present, and future. That single cufflink Victoria found is the only crack in his perfect plan. It's terrifying to be married to someone with that kind of reach. Do you think this is his twisted way of protecting her? Or just pure possession?
The library was dim, the only light coming from the embers of the fireplace and the glow of Julian's tablet. He sat in his usual chair, a glass of scotch resting on the side table untouched. He looked up as Victoria entered, her silhouette framed by the hallway light. She didn't stop to remove her coat. She walked straight to the low mahogany table between them and slammed her hand down. She lifted her palm. The gold cufflink sat there, catching the firelight, a damning piece of evidence against the velvet runner. You missed a spot, Victoria said, her voice trembling with a rage she had suppressed for a decade. Julian looked at the cufflink, then up at her. His expression didn't change. There was no flicker of guilt, no widening of the eyes. He simply reached out, picked up the small gold stud, and inspected it as if checking for scratches. Careless of me, he murmured. I suppose the cleaners I hired weren't as thorough as I paid them to be. You were in his studio, Victoria accused, stepping closer. You went there. You erased him. I tidied up, Julian corrected, placing the cufflink in his pocket. I removed anything that could link my wife to a dead man. You should be thanking me, Victoria. Do you have any idea what the press would do with your love letters? They were poetic, if a bit derivative. You killed him, she whispered, the words hanging heavy in the air. I found the phone, Julian. I saw the messages, the deal. You cut his brakes because he wouldn't take your money, because he loved me. Julian let out a short, dry laugh. It was a sound devoid of humor. He picked up his scotch, swirled the amber liquid, and looked at her with pity. That look hurt more than his anger ever could. Oh, Victoria, he said softly, you really are a romantic, aren't you? He tapped the screen of his tablet and slid it across the table toward her. I didn't kill him, Julian said. And he didn't refuse the money. He negotiated. Victoria looked down at the screen. It was a scanned image of a bank transfer authorization, dated the night of the accident. Time-stamped 9:45 p.m., 2 hours before the crash. The amount was $500,000. The recipient was Chase Rivers. He took it? Victoria asked, her voice barely audible. He took it with a smile, Julian said, leaning back. He was a starving artist, darling. He saw an opportunity. I offered him a choice. Run away with you and live on love and fumes, or take $500,000 and disappear alone. He didn't even hesitate. He signed the non-disclosure agreement before the ink was dry. Victoria felt the room tilt. You're lying. The dash cam. He was arguing. He said, I can't do this. He was arguing with his bookie, Julian said, delivering the final blow. Or perhaps a debt collector. I did a background check, Victoria. Your Chase was in deep. Gambling debts, sharks circling. The money I gave him wasn't for a new life. It was to save his kneecaps. He wasn't speeding to get to you. He was speeding to get to the airport before his creditors found him. Victoria stared at the transfer document. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably Chase's. The loop of the C, the sharp slant of the R. He sold me, she whispered. He sold us, Julian corrected. He was never fighting for you, Victoria. He was fighting for a payout. The accident? That was just bad luck. Or maybe karma. But don't look at me as the villain here. I'm the one who paid a fortune to keep your dignity intact. He stood up and walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. It was heavy, suffocating. I knew about him from the first week, Julian whispered in her ear. I let you have your fun, but when it became inconvenient, I ended it. Not with violence, but with a checkbook. Because that's all he was worth. Victoria stood frozen. The grief that had fueled her for days suddenly turned to ash. Chase hadn't died a martyr for their love. He had died a rich man running away from it. Victoria stared at the bank transfer on the screen until the numbers blurred into meaningless black shapes. $500,000. The price of her heart. She wanted to scream, to throw the tablet into the fire, to claw the smug look off Julian's face, but her limbs felt heavy, weighed down by a crushing numbness. He might have taken the money, Victoria said, her voice sounding brittle like dry leaves stepping on pavement. But that doesn't mean he didn't love me. Maybe he was going to ask me to go with him. Maybe he needed the money for us. It was a pathetic defense, and she knew it. She was grasping at smoke. Julian sighed, a sound of genuine exhaustion. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't legal stationery or a bank document. It was a photocopy of a forensic data recovery report, the kind Detective Miller would have attached to the case file. "I didn't want to show you this," Julian lied smoothly. "I thought the check would be enough to wake you up, but you insist on playing the martyr." He placed the paper on the table, face down. "The police recovered the text logs from his phone," Julian said. "They managed to retrieve the messages sent in the minutes before the crash, the ones he was typing while driving, one-handed in the rain." Victoria reached for the paper. Her hand shook so violently that the paper rattled against the mahogany surface. She turned it over. The log showed a conversation thread. The recipient wasn't listed as a name, just a number, but the timestamp was damning: 11:16 p.m., 1 minute before impact. "Chase. Done deal. The husband paid out. $500K. Unknown number. Seriously? He actually paid?" Chase. "Didn't even blink. Easier than we thought. I'm leaving the studio now." Unknown number. "What about her? Does she know?" Chase. "No. Let her rot in that mansion. She's too cold to notice I'm gone anyway. I'll pick you up in 20. We're going to Rio, baby." Victoria read the line again. "She's too cold to notice I'm gone anyway." The air in the room seemed to vanish. The man who had painted her, who had whispered that she was his muse, who had worshipped her body with a reverence she had never known, had called her cold to another woman. "Her name is Vanessa Drake," Julian supplied helpfully, taking a sip of his scotch. "A waitress at the Blue Moon Bar. Apparently they've been together for 2 years. You were a project, Victoria. A very lucrative project." Victoria dropped the paper. It fluttered to the floor, landing next to the gold cufflink. "The accident happened because he was texting her back," Julian continued, his voice devoid of malice, which made it all the more cruel. "He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at his future with someone else. He didn't die thinking of you. He died laughing at you." The silence that followed was absolute. The fire crackled, a mocking sound of warmth in a room that had turned to ice. Victoria felt a physical pain in her chest, a sharp, tearing sensation. It wasn't heartbreak. It was the death of her ego. She had risked everything: her reputation, her marriage, her sanity, for a man who saw her as nothing more than a paycheck. She hadn't been a tragic heroine in a romance novel. She had been the punchline of a con artist's joke. And Julian had known. He had watched her sneak out, watched her lie, watched her fall in love with a phantom, all while holding the strings. He hadn't stopped it because he wasn't threatened by it. He knew exactly how cheap her betrayal was. "Why?" Victoria whispered, looking up at her husband. Her eyes were dry now. She had no tears left for Chase Rivers. "Why didn't you just divorce me? Why go through all this?" Julian set his glass down. He stood up and walked around the table, stopping in front of her. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch cool and proprietary. "Divorce is messy, Victoria. It divides assets. It invites public scrutiny. And besides," he tilted her chin up so she had to look him in the eye, "I don't like losing things that belong to me, even if they are broken." He stepped back, checking his watch. "The funeral is tomorrow. Private service, you will attend. You will wear black. You will cry, but not too much. And then we will go on, because that is what we do." He turned and walked toward the door. "Good night, Victoria." Victoria sat alone in the library. She looked at the cufflink on the floor, then at the police report. She realized then that Julian hadn't just killed Chase Rivers. He had killed the part of her that believed she deserved to be loved. He had orchestrated the perfect tragedy, and now he expected her to applaud. The funeral was a small, tasteful affair at a chapel in Cambridge. It rained, of course. It always seemed to rain when the St. James family had business to attend to. Victoria stood in the back row, wearing a black veil that was perhaps too dramatic for a mere art patron, but Julian had insisted. He stood beside her, his umbrella held perfectly aloft, shielding her not just from the elements, but from the curious glances of the few mourners who had gathered. There was no Vanessa Drake. The woman Chase had died texting. The woman he had planned to run to Rio with hadn't shown up. Perhaps she knew better than to cross paths with the St. James estate. Or perhaps, without the $500,000, she simply didn't care enough to say goodbye. The drive back to Beacon Hill was silent. The city of Boston rolled past the tinted windows, gray, historic, and indifferent. Victoria watched the raindrops race each other down the glass. She felt a strange envy for Chase. He was in the ground. He was cold, yes, but he was done. He had escaped the tangled web of lies, debts, and disappointments. He was free. She, on the other hand, was going home. When they entered the foyer, the house felt larger than before. The silence was absolute. The staff had made themselves scarce, sensing the mood. Julian hung his coat in the closet, his movements efficient and unburdened. He checked his watch, the gold Rolex gleaming under the chandelier. "I have a conference call with Tokyo in an hour," he said, adjusting his cuffs. It was the same tone he used to order dinner or dismiss a driver. "We should have dinner at 7. I believe Cook is making the roast." Victoria looked at him. He was terrifyingly unaffected. He had paid a man to leave, watched that man die, revealed the sordid truth to his wife, and attended the funeral. All without a hair out of place. He was a machine built for survival, and she was just a component in his engine. "I'm going upstairs to change," Victoria said. Her voice was steady. The trembling had stopped. "Take your time," Julian replied, already turning toward his study. "We have all the time in the world, Victoria." She walked up the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the banister. In the master bedroom, she closed the door and locked it. It was a futile gesture. Julian had the keys to every door in this house, metaphorically and literally. But it gave her a moment of illusion. She walked to the vanity table and sat down. The mirror was an antique French piece. The glass, slightly silvered with age. She stared at her reflection. Who was looking back? It wasn't the passionate lover who had laughed in a dusty studio. That woman was dead, killed by a text message and a bank transfer. It wasn't the naive wife who thought she could keep a secret from Julian St. James. That woman had been foolish. The face in the mirror was pale, beautiful, and utterly empty. It was a mask that cost millions of dollars to maintain. She reached up and unpinned her hat, letting the veil fall to the floor. She began to remove her makeup, wiping away the layers of foundation, the mascara, the lipstick. She wanted to see if there was anything real underneath. But as the makeup vanished, the face remained the same. Cold, distant. St. James. The door handle turned. The lock clicked open. Victoria didn't jump. She didn't turn around. She watched in the mirror as Julian entered the room. He walked up behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. His grip was firm, possessive. He looked at her reflection, his dark eyes meeting hers in the glass. "You look tired," he said softly. "I am," Victoria replied. "It will pass," Julian assured her. Scandals fade, grief fades, people forget. We endure. He leaned down and kissed the top of her head. It was a kiss of ownership. He had won. He had kept his wife, his reputation, and his life. He had stripped her of her illusions so thoroughly that she had no choice but to rely on his reality. Victoria looked at their reflection, the handsome, powerful husband and his dutiful, elegant wife. It was a perfect picture. It was a portrait of hell. She realized then that leaving him would be the easy way out. The divorce, the shame, the poverty, that would be freedom. But she was a Sterling, and she was a St. James. She didn't have the courage to be poor. She didn't have the courage to be alone. She had chosen this cage years ago. Chase had just been a temporary reprieve. She picked up her hairbrush, her movements mechanical. "I thought hiding the truth was the hard part, Julian," she said, her eyes never leaving his in the mirror. Julian paused, his hand still on her shoulder. "And now?" Victoria lowered the brush. A single dry tear traced a path down her clean, pale cheek. "Now I know that living with yours is the real punishment." Julian smiled, a small, tight curvature of his lips. "Then it's a good thing we have the rest of our lives to serve it."
Wow. That ending leaves a heavy feeling in the chest, doesn't it? It wasn't about forgiveness or moving on. It was about accepting the cage you built for yourself. Victoria and Julian are bound together not by love, but by their dark secrets and mutual destruction. If you were in Victoria's shoes, knowing what you know now, would you have stayed in that gilded cage? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If this story touched you or surprised you, please leave a like and share it with someone who loves a good drama. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.